Director of the Center for Philosophy of Science and the host of the podcast Conversations at the Center. Today, we are welcoming Alison McConwell, who is a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science. Alison, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thanks, Edward, for having me. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. My work mainly focuses on the history and philosophy of the biological sciences. I've worked on questions concerning biological individuality. I do a lot of archival work, especially on Stephen Jay Gould's concept of contingency as an organizing principle of history. And like you said, I'm a visiting fellow at the center this term and really happy to be here.
I think it's also worth mentioning that you just published a book on biological individuality. So do you want to tell us where it's published and what the title is?
Yeah, thanks. So I published an element. The title is Biological Individuality, and it's published with Cambridge University Press.
All right, thank you. I highly recommend that book. It's a wonderful piece of work. So today we're not going to discuss biological individuality, but we're going to discuss the topic of science and values. And the reason we're doing that is that the center has organized now a couple of weeks ago a large conference on science and values following the lead of senior visiting fellow Arnon Levy. And we've had a sequence of 4 podcasts, today is the 4th one, on this topic. So to get us started, Alison, there seems to be an increased interest on the topic of science and values. What do you think this increased interest is due to?
Yeah, so that conference was fascinating in terms of how it was connecting values in science research to other areas like general epistemology and political philosophy. But to your question, I'm not so sure about the increased interest. I think that there's been a longstanding interest in values in science, at least extending back to Thomas Kuhn, but I'm also thinking that philosophers now, especially those who follow the work of Helen Longino and Heather Douglas, are looking for or to further those types of research programs by starting with value-laden science as a premise. So, now that we accept that value or that science is value-laden, then what follows and what should be done about it? I think that the interest extends back, like I said, at least to Thomas Kuhn, the 60s and 70s. He articulated the role of theoretical virtues, or what philosophers later termed epistemic values. He talked a lot about consensus in scientific communities. And we owe a lot to feminist philosophers in the late 20th century, early 21st century. They brought a lot of STS and sociology of scientific knowledge research through casework, historical analysis, interdisciplinary analysis to challenge kind of longstanding distinctions. So, to your question, I think it's been a longstanding research program, but the entry or the approach has slightly changed.
Good. So I think the end of your answer really lead us to your own work. You are writing a book on how scientific interests, personal interests, social interests, and values are enmeshed or entangled in evolutionary biology in the 20th century, I understand. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the book, what its main ideas are, what its main focus are, what you're trying to do with it?
Yeah, so the book emerges from archival research that I've been doing over the last 7 years. It's about how social and political values and technical work were in fact intertwined, but were presented by major proponents of the new discipline emerging in the mid-20th century of evolutionary biology. They were presented as disentangled values and technical work. And it's really that image or the presentation of neutrality that I'm especially interested in. Stephen Jay Gould once called this the worst lie, although I think his characterization is not quite correct. And there's a lot of other criticisms in terms of the way that science is presented versus how it's actually done. So I'm interested in exactly the ways that social commitments infiltrate technical aspects of the life sciences in the mid-20th century, but also the influence in the opposite direction too, right? Their technical biological research was viewed as a new legitimate source for resolving social issues, and of course that assumption provided the ability for biologists to make, in their eyes, epistemically authoritative claims in the social domain that was previously dominated by humanistic inquiry. So I think as philosophers, we're often concerned with how values encroach on science, but I also want to point to the opposite direction, or what happens when science inflates beyond what we might think is its appropriate epistemic jurisdiction.
Fascinating. A lot of things I'd like to follow up right now on. One of them is you mentioned the contrast between the actual place of values in scientific research and the ideology, one might say, that values and science are two different worlds or two different spheres. Why is that? So why are values, or why were values for a very long time thought to be not to belong to scientific research?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it's a really hard question to answer. And this kind of relates to the first question you asked, which is like why has there been an increased interest? And I think we've been talking a lot about the origins of the value-free ideal. Where does it come from? Why do we think that science is why was this ideal kind of a dominant view in, let's say, positive philosophy in the mid-20th century, kind of keeping values out of the logical reconstruction of scientific reasoning? And looking back at that time, many philosophers, many scientists were really concerned about science being kind of co-opted for nefarious regimes. Think like, especially like following the interwar era and what was known as the Soviet failure. So I think there was, they were trying to kind of protect science from being used in ways that were problematic. So I think that this has been this really amounts to a question of what's the relationship and what should the relationship be between state and or social aspects of state and science relations or relationships. So I'm not sure if that
it does. It does answer the question to a large extent. But I had another follow-up to your first set of comments. You mentioned that Gould's claim that there's something of a lie going on in science, where people pretend in some ways that their values do not influence their research. I wonder whether it's the right diagnostic. And I think the thought I have is that it's a little bit naive to think that scientists are lying. Everyone knows that values influence science. The thing is, it's not allowed in the public aspects of science, when you're providing argument, evidence, to mention the values that have inspired your research. Exactly as everyone knows that a scientific paper is not a reflection of how the science was done, but it's a way of conveying some information in the public sphere of scientific communication. So on that view, it's kind of a misdiagnosis to think that scientists are lying. They just obey norms of communication that forbids them, that do not allow them to present values as a relevant source for believing in scientific claims. What do you think of that alternative interpretation in that response to Gould?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Gould certainly, while he had some experience with philosophy, he was not a philosopher by training. In calling kind of what he referred to as the veil of objectivity or neutrality as the worst lie, I think he was trying to point to what felt like a disconnect between, how science is kind of presented and maybe the norms around or expectations around how it should be presented in a way that kind of abstracts away from, the values that were involved in the actual practice of producing those published products. So, I agree with you that it's something of a misdiagnosis. It's too quick to say that it's like an active lie, or it's almost like it sounds conspiratorial, in a way, which is not what we would want. But you pointed to sort of these expectations or norms around how scientists present their work that may in fact be kind of an explanation or an issue responsible for that disconnect. And I think that's right. We should be looking into the professionalization practices of scientific communities in terms of, why it's presented that way. I mean, one thing that Gould proposed, which I think is kind of interesting and fits with current values in science research, is he kind of said, I put my cards on the table so that people can kind of track back to see where I came from. But he was concerned with technical presentations hiding the kind of masking the value commitments of other folks that he was critical of. So it speaks to something we might call like a track back, track forward view, right, where he wants some transparency. But yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. And I think it raises quite deep questions about what's the right social organization of science. On the one hand, we might want norms that says it doesn't really matter what your private values are. Of course, you believe things in part because of your private value. But when you're trying to convince other people, you should set aside your private values and just focus on the empirical evidence. And if indeed you might have any values for endorsing the claim, but this is just not quite relevant in the context of scientific communication. Or we might have good positions that says, well, actually, the best solution is, in fact, to be transparent and that everyone is transparent about the values that motivate their research or their reluctance to accept other people's research. And I think it's a really deep question about what's the best set of norms for governing scientific communication. I don't have any strong opinion on the matter, but I think it does really touch on difficult issue, I believe.
Absolutely. I mean, and especially when we think, and at least my focus concerns the history of the life sciences from a philosophical perspective. So I really think a lot about how someone like Thomas Huxley was involved in the late 1800s, kind of professionalizing the life sciences into disciplines in the way that we know them now, sort of distinguishing them in a way that you had to have kind of a grasp of specialized jargon. There were certain norms around kind of community membership that went beyond just having a degree and the authority to make these kinds of claims. And so when we think about professionalization norms of presentation, I think it's a really interesting and maybe a philosophically underserved area to understand why science is presented in the way that it is.
All right, let's move to not the whole book, but to a part of the book. You've done some really exciting work on Haldane and John Huxley's both scientific and political views, and about how their political views and scientific views are entangled. Could you just tell us a bit more about that part of your work, and maybe reminding the listeners about who Haldane and Huxley were?
Yeah, so J.B.S. Haldane and Julian Huxley, they each emerged from their own family dynasties of academics. It's important to understand that they were kind of celebrities and prolific writers of their day in the early into mid 20th century. J.B.S. Haldane was a geneticist. He was known for a series of papers in the 20s, early 30s. He was known for his writings on heredity and politics, among other things. Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Huxley, Julian conducted early empirical work, but became known later on kind of as a science popularizer, conducting a lot of scientific reviews to draw conclusions about certain things. He coined the name of the era, the modern synthesis, in 1942, kind of colloquially known as uniting or bringing together Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian principles of heredity. But of course, there's a ton of debate over the date range, whether there was conceptual unity, and so forth. And so these two individuals were really important in that regard. But you asked, how their views were enmeshed, and Haldane, for example, he maintained that we were caught in something of a dilemma between science's immaturity and the strong likelihood of evolutionary decline. So they were debating kind of progress and decline in life's history and what was to come of human society. And human society, this became ultimately an evolutionary question for them. There were a lot of assumptions. We're working against a background context of eugenics. There were a lot of assumptions about hereditary views about intelligence and so forth. So it's important to be sensitive to that context. But he, for example, Haldane, in talking about decline and degeneration, he worked very hard on it. His views on that directed his scientific research program. He worked very hard to try to establish the material conditions of heredity. He thought that abolishing class structure in society would be a way to kind of hold the conditions of society stable that would allow us to determine the innate causes of human characteristics that we desired. And so you get this kind of very entanglement of his political views and his scientific work. Huxley was a bit different. He had very clear social and metaphysical commitments to evolutionary progress early on, what that would look like in terms of cultivating the ideal human type or the ideal human society. He constructed a lifelong research program that's surprisingly consistent. Not all historical figures are consistent. There's often tensions, early in life for someone versus how they develop their research programs later in life. But he iteratively returns to kind of these social commitments in a way that informs his scientific work, and then he would kind of return to his empirical and scientific work to justify his social commitments about progress. So you see this kind of cyclical engagement with him that's pretty consistent.
So do you think there are many similar cases where scientists or maybe evolutionary biologists political and moral values influence their research, and vice versa? Their empirical commitments, their theoretical commitments have an influence on their moral and political values.
Yeah, so I mean, this is partly what the book is about. I think doing some qualitative and historical analysis and some casework in that regard. I think there are more cases. I think there, especially concerning the presentation element, what I find fascinating about Huxley is that he actively presented, his scientific and social worldviews as completely independent, yet they were part of the very same research program. And so that presentation, there appeared to be norms around how, their approaches to social issues, like how that should be done properly, and what would count as respectable performance in that regard. So, kind of concrete examples, if you fast forward several years later, you see someone like Stephen Jay Gould. He was a student of the modern synthesis. Many of his mentors and still living proponents of that era, were very critical of his popularizing, of his work addressing social issues. So there's this piece of correspondence between him and Ledyard Stebbins. Betty Smokovitis is a historian who does some excellent work on Stebbins, but he was a botanist known for his role in the modern synthesis, and he kind of asked Gould, who do you want to be? Do you want to be the next Carl Sagan, twisting truth and sensationalizing, or the venerable Thomas Huxley, involved in the professionalization of the life sciences, who discussed values and social issues in an appropriate way? I think Gould is an interesting contrast case because he denied that the evolutionary sciences were a legitimate source of authority on social problems, whereas these others did not. Their approaches to kind of social issues were much more about expanding the epistemic jurisdiction of the life sciences to address those problems. So I think that there are more similar cases, but again, I'm really focused on kind of that presentation element and the way, the positioning or the posturing towards social issues that we see.
Good. Abstracting from these cases that you're looking at in the book, what do you think this work in the history and philosophy of contemporary biology or 20th century biology tell us about the place of values in science, their role, their legitimacy, and how to organize the influence, maybe the necessary influence, the unavoidable influence of values on scientific research?
Yeah, so I think that, or what I'm hoping, is that these cases do more than establish iterative directions of influence between science and values. I mean, certainly they do, but they point to larger questions of what I like to call epistemic jurisdictions and negotiations that occur at the boundaries of different domains, which I think is very interesting. These become really disciplinary level questions about legitimacy and authority. And so, we as philosophers, we talk a lot about the way, like I said, that values do and how they should or shouldn't encroach on science, but I see somewhat less attention on science encroaching in the other direction, right, on social issues and how to identify it. And it's as if, we're all familiar with scientism, sort of like a system of beliefs about science's kind of power and authority on these issues, but I actually think that this is not something of the past. It's something that we should be thinking about, especially in relation to contemporary debates around STEM, let's say, as kind of a super collective discipline and the power that it is gaining and maintains in relation to social issues. And so as philosophers, we really have a responsibility, in my view, to be thinking about those sorts of things.
Yeah, I entirely agree that the discussion has been, in a way, unidirectional from values to science, but philosophers working in this area of philosophy of science have had quite little to say about how science should impact values and our political views. So that's a really exciting and interesting topic. I'd like to broaden a little bit since we're getting close to the end of this podcast. You started with Gould, and you mentioned Gould a few times. I know you're fascinated by Gould, and I know you'd like to write one day a book on Gould, I believe. Is that in the work? And what's the connection between the work on Gould and the work you're doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, well, so good question. I mean, I imagine that I'll probably spend my entire life working on a book on Gould. There are like certain methods in doing biography and other things that I would want to be sure that I can master before I really approach that. But it's definitely in the back of my mind. I mean, the Gould archives have over 700 boxes of content. I'll probably spend my entire life trying to get through those as well. I guess the reason why Gould is such a big influence, and I don't want to put Gould on a pedestal. I want to be careful about that, right? I mean, he has been accused by Daniel Dennett and other folks of kind of allowing for himself what he did not permit to others, which is talking about questions of values, right? And so we need to be kind of careful about that. But I think that his positioning in terms of trying to mitigate scientific harm, keeping science within its proper bounds as he saw it, trying to kind of defer expertise to those in humanistic inquiry is notable. And he was very much worried about kind of the impact of an unchecked science in the social impact of that. So he often did a lot of historical analysis. He was concerned with social justice in a way that I think is important and serves as a bit of a contrast case for how the biological sciences were viewed as applying or answering social problems. He kind of turned around and said, we need to be really careful about that kind of encroachment. So, yeah, I'll probably spend the rest of my life working on a book on Gould, but I think that there are important lessons, especially the way that he talked about the power of particulars, and that history is we can say more about history. It's not just one damn thing after another, but there are organizing principles that can allow us to there's power in narrative, there's power in historical explanation, and because I work a lot on the historical sciences, these things matter for how I do my work.
Very good. In fact, that's going to lead me to my last question, something that I'm sure our listeners have picked on. Your work is deeply integrating the history of science and the philosophy of science. It's a great example of what we call here at Pitt, so history and philosophy of science, which is my home department. So could you just tell us a little bit more about HPS, history and philosophy of science, why you think it is a proper methodology, I suppose you do, for the kind of work you're trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think historical analysis can be very powerful, and I think interdisciplinarity in particular is very important. And this is part of, when we opened, I mentioned that we owe a lot to feminist philosophers of science who really worked hard to bring findings and knowledge from other disciplines to philosophical questions. I think, I come from an emerging generation of junior scholars and philosophers who are interested. We were embedded in scientific communities during our graduate training. We're interested in things like participant observation. Shout out to Rose Trapps, who I think is still at Exeter, who has been doing some kind of very cool integrative social science work with philosophy and questions of individuality. And bringing, I think we tend to get locked in these distinctions or these dichotomies, epistemic values, non-epistemic values. context of discovery, context of justification. And one thing that historical analysis does well is kind of unpack dichotomies that we get locked in, and it can be freeing in that regard, so that we can try to articulate new questions going forward. So I think that interdisciplinarity, HPS in particular, right, is just very important for how we think about philosophical questions, and staying close to the sciences as well.
All right. I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful episode. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.